Hello, and welcome to an introductory video on RHA meetings. Within this video, I will briefly go over what the NCC role is, including a little bit of information about conferences and bidding, but then be spending the majority of the video on talking about parliamentary procedure and what our actual RHA meetings will look like throughout the year. Let's get started. So the NCC role is known as the National Communications Coordinator. The NCC is very similar to what the floor representatives are to Hall Council, what the rep-at-larges are to RHA. The NCC represents all of the UC Santa Barbara's community at our National Association of College and University Residence Halls, known as NACUR. Now, NACUR is a large national organization and has many different branches within it. UC Santa Barbara belongs to the Pacific affiliate branch of NACUR, otherwise known as PACUR. Now, PACUR itself is made up of a wide variety of schools. We have schools from Canada, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, and of course California. Now, these NCCs from all of these schools get together virtually many times throughout the year, along with the RHA presidents getting together and the NRHH presidents getting together. But every so often, we do like to get together and see each other face to face, which is where conferences come into play. Throughout the year, there are 3 conferences: the Regional Leadership Conference, the Regional Business Conference, and the NACUR Annual Conference, all taking place at different schools across the country or across our region, respectively. These conferences are awesome because the NCC will typically take students from UC Santa Barbara to actually go with them to these conferences. There, you all will be able to attend presentations and workshops, go into boardroom and actually vote on bids and awards, participate in philanthropy, and of course, show off the UCSB spirit. Before attending this conference, though, typically the NCC will work on what are called bids. Bids are a form of recognition and communication between schools. What they're doing, how we're doing it, why it's important for our residents. They're more of like an in-depth and lengthier version of an OTM, which is an Of the Month award, which is something we will talk about later on in training. I mentioned bids along with conferences because the NCC will be voting on all of these kinds of things using what's called Parliamentary Procedure, or otherwise known for short as ParliPro. So let's begin by talking about what ParliPro actually looks like in terms of terms and definitions. So our meetings have 5 major sections. We have the call to order, which is the formal beginning to the meeting. We have the roll call, which is attendance. We have our largest section, known as flyering, finance, and support requests. We have our discussion, which could take up the longest amount of time. And then we end with adjournment, which is basically just a formal end of the meeting. Now, in order to conduct business and have our meeting, we need to meet what's called quorum. Quorum is just the number of members present for business to be done. In RHA, that just means we need to have 50% plus 1 in order to have a majority of members present in order to conduct our business. Now, there is a 2/3 majority needed for other things such as amendments and the Judicial Review Board's business. However, all of that stuff is specifically stated within our Constitution and will be brought up and reminded to you all when the time comes. Now, since I said that discussion takes the longest, it's important to understand why. Within discussion, when discussing maybe a finance request or a flyering request, typically we'll do something called pro-con, where it's a 2-minute timer. You have 5 words to say a pro about the discussion point or to add a discussion point in terms of a con. Typically we do this by taking a speakers list, which is having a 5-minute time total. We have a first, a second, and a third speakers list. This way everyone gets the opportunity to talk. And we can extend that 5-minute timer up to 3 times. So it could last 15 minutes just for one topic. And eventually we could also move to exhaust the speakers list, which will close out the current list that we have after the last person on it is done talking, so this way we can continue moving the meeting forward. Now, in order to start a discussion, we must first have what is called a motion. And a motion is a formal proposal that the coordinating board actually start to talk and think about something. And now there are 4 parts to a motion. You must first present a motion, someone must second the motion, we must then as a group debate the motion, and finally we all vote on the motion. In order to do this process though, someone must first say they motion to do blank, whether that is bring a flying request to the floor or a funding request to the floor. They motion to do that. Someone can also move to amend the motion by saying, hey, we're talking about this topic for 5 minutes. I want to amend the motion so we talk about it for 10 minutes. When everything is all done and said, you can also call to question, which is basically saying, let's vote on the motion. Or you can move to table this motion until next meeting, thinking that maybe everyone needs a little bit more time to think about whatever it is that we are talking about. In order to motion, though, there is a procedure. First, you must obtain the floor by either raising your placard or your hand. You must get recognized to speak. Then you make your motion, and the chair will ask if someone will second the motion. Finally, we move into the expansion, discussion, and then eventually the close, which is the call to question, whether we are voting on the actual motion, if we're going to amend the actual motion, and amendments can get a little bit tricky in terms of whether or not the amendment is friendly with the people who made the original motion or not, and so that process might get repeated a few times. The final piece of information that you should know about parliamentary procedure is the discussion regulations. And so there are many different points that you can make throughout parliamentary procedure in order to have the meeting flow faster. The first point is dissent. And dissent is something that will be asked by the chair to everyone there, asking whether or not if anyone dissents to the motion being made. Does everyone basically agree with it is another way of phrasing that. They're just asking if anyone has an issue with what we're talking about, and if so, just to make themselves known. The next 5 points are all points of blank, which can all be used to gather more information throughout the meeting in order to resolve a personal issue or in order to ask a question. So for example, you could say point of information, which is to request further information. You could say point of clarification, which is to clarify something that is confusing for everyone. So at that point, you're necessarily providing information as opposed to asking a question. You can have a point of personal privilege, which is to resolve a pressing issue that's personal. Point of personal privilege, it's a little cold in here, can we close the windows? You can say point of order, which is typically only called by the president or parliamentarian in order to bring the room back to discussion. Or finally, you can say a point of inquiry, which is to the parliamentarian for further explanation. So you can say point of inquiry, what are we doing and what is the procedure? And the NCC/parliamentarian will help you figure that out. Next, you can also say yield to redundancy, yield your time, or yield your vote. And yielding is basically just a way of saying, I'm going to give something of mine to somebody else. So for example, when you yield to redundancy, you're saying, hey, I already agree with something that someone else has already brought up, so I'm just going to yield to redundancy because it has already been said before. You can yield your vote if you are leaving the meeting a little early and say, hey, I'm going to yield my vote to the Hall Council president sitting next to me because I have to go, and this was something that was already brought up to the admin vice president, they know you're leaving. Or finally, you can yield your time by saying, hey, I've gotten 5 minutes from you all to speak about this issue, but I'm done in 2 minutes, so therefore I'm going to yield my time back to the meeting so we can continue this meeting and get out faster. Now, in order to remember all this information, on the back of your name placards, which you'll have at every meeting, will be this diagram. And this diagram helps us remember what parliamentary procedure looks like. So first at the top, you have to make a motion, and then it says, is there a second? Yes, you move down. If no, the motion is lost. And so on and so forth. It goes through discussion, it goes through amendments, it goes through calling to question and voting. And all of this information is on the back of your placard for you to reference and follow along throughout the meeting, so this way we don't get lost as much. So now we're going to move into what an actual RHA meeting at UCSB looks like. So before we go over some slides, there are a few important ground rules for you to know. Meetings are typically on Tuesdays from either 6 to 8 or 6:30 to 8:30, we'll let you know. Attendance is mandatory. However, if you are not going to be able to make it to a meeting, you will need to send a proxy and let the admin vice president know who your proxy is ahead of time. It is important that you're early. Being early to a meeting is really just saying that you're going to be on time, because if you are going to be late, that is grounds for possible losing your voting rights for that night, especially if you're not there to hear what the presentations are talking about. We ask that you please don't have your phones or laptops out during presentations. The exception for this is the executive board, as they're typically taking notes or running the PowerPoint from their laptop. And finally, we ask that you pay attention to presentations. Side conversations often lead to you all not hearing important information, which can result in you asking questions that the presenter has already answered, and we want to give the presenter as much respect as we can. So here's what a typical meeting actually looks like. The following slides were taken from our February 4th, 2020 meeting, which was the 5th meeting of the winter quarter. And usually during the opening slide here, we have our call to order, where we get the meeting started and we take attendance. Next, we move into flying requests. For this meeting, we had 2 flying requests. We had one from CalPERG and their voter registration drive, which was coming up. So they showed us a little bit what their flyer looked like. They gave us a brief description of what they were talking about and what their meeting and event was about, and gave us all of the event details. Next, we had Gaucho Gaming, who did the same thing. They gave us a little blurb about the event, about the organization. They showed us what the flyer looked like and gave us all the details for us to vote on. Next, we moved into funding requests. For these requests, we had 3 for this meeting. The first one was from BFOM and Vocal Motion, where they had a $700 request for an upcoming concert that they were going to put on. So they told us a little bit about their event, they gave us the date, the time, the location, as well as they told us how they were advertising. Next, we had a presenter from Casa Game Night, the Korean American Student Association. They were asking for $182 for their event. Same deal where they gave us a little description about the event. They told us the date, time, location, and how they were planning to advertise. And finally, we had a presenter from Gaucho Gaming Movie Night come in and request $606, where again they told us a little bit more about their event. They told us about the date, the time, the location, and how they were planning to advertise as well. While the presenters are there, we can ask them as many questions as we can about their event, because once they leave and if we have a question about something, we're not really supposed to just kind of make assumptions on what's going to happen within their event. So we need to be sure to make sure we ask them all of the questions that we can. Once all the presenters are done presenting though, they will leave and we will continue on with talking about all of these requests and which ones we'd like to approve first. And so at this point we might flip back and forth within the presentation to talk about something. So say we motion to bring Casa Game Night to the floor and discuss their $182 request. We'll talk about that completely and then we'll bring up the next flying request or next funding request until we have no more requests to go through. Once that's all done, we'll make sure that we've approved the minutes from the last few times meetings. Sometimes we get a little backed up and we need to go ahead and just approve those meetings, whether they're core board meeting minutes or finance committee meeting minutes. And then we'll also get an update on what our finances look like. So for example, this is what our finance update was for that week. It was broken down into our 4 financial categories that we allocate money to student organizations and groups from. So we have diversity, external, core board, and internal. It's broken up between how much we've allocated for those accounts, how much we've spent out of those accounts, and how much is remaining. Once we've done that, that pretty much concludes all of the business that we need to get through for the meeting. And so then we'll move into executive updates, where each of the executive board members will get an opportunity to tell us about things that they're working on or things that are coming down the pipe with events that they need to go over with us. Finally, the advisors will also get an opportunity to talk and tell us about what's going on in their realms or remind us about issues that are going on within the offices. And then at the end of the meeting, we're all done. At this time, we all get to make some general announcements that we all might have. And then once the meeting is over, all of the presidents and reps will move to their individual hall council meetings, while the specialty and exec members are done for the night. However, that doesn't mean that they're not going to finish meeting with their groups later on throughout the week. Now, I know this video was very dense with parliamentary procedure information as well as meeting information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out as soon as you can. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.